Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. And hello, everybody. Good evening. Always great to be here. The topic I want to talk about tonight has to do with our old friend resentments and releasing resentments. And just want to talk a little bit about that because it's um, when we're really carrying a major strong resentment, it's pretty clear. But I think resentments can kind of camouflage themselves sometimes in different forms, and we can kind of be blindsided by them. So I want to talk a little bit about how they manifest and more importantly, what we can do about them when we get to them. But, we've all felt it, that resentment, that bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. There's a lot of victim mentality that goes with these injuries that we've had. And I think there's probably no more dangerous mindset for an addict than that place of having been wronged, because I think we could just take that and run with it. And at least when I was in my addiction, I had very limited insight and perspective, and so I didn't really see my role in a lot of this. I just was kind of the big victim and carrying a lot of resentments. And by the way, these resentments can be held against people in our lives, but they can be against God. They can be against other people long dead. They can be against entities. They can be against organizations. They can be against ourselves. And all those things that can be a pretty complicated mess of resentments if they start to accumulate. But the bottom line, no matter who the resentment is targeted toward, it always ends up hurting us more. And I think that's the bottom line of resentment. It's kind of the big lesson, is that the cost and the price we pay for carrying these and harboring them is really ultimately destructive. And not to say that part of that destruction also includes, of course, the addiction and the greatly increased risk of addictive behavior if we don't have a way to release those resentments, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So I talked about different forms. What are some of those forms that resentment looks like? When there are going to be these ongoing intense emotions, especially if we're thinking about a situation. How many of us, or how many hours have we spent ruminating about something that happened? I remember talking to someone and they were just really, really upset about something that somebody did to them, going on and on. I think he was in tears and just flushed anger and just rage. And I said, God, when did this happen? It was like 4 years ago. Oh, okay. So they've been carrying this for a while. I think that's what we do. We hang on to the stuff, and it just kind of, it becomes this like closed loop in our head that just kind of goes around and builds. So that's that ruminating piece that goes with resentments. It kind of gets in our head, and boy, we latch onto it and just think about it over and over. What we should have said, what we didn't do, what we might have done, what somebody else might have done. All these what ifs that is just really a mind game that just ends up with no productive outlet. Feeling regret. And I think a lot of these other kinds of feelings don't quite feel like resentments, can also harbor as resentment. So regret, fear, a lot of fear about avoidance or conflict can also kind of lead to resentment. Tense relationships, feeling inadequate, feeling less than, which is a standard mindset for any addict. But what does that do? We project that onto somebody else. And so if I'm not feeling very good about myself, I may not be able to really realize that or own that for me, but I can just kind of project that resentment on somebody else. So it kind of bounces around with these different perspectives. It can be very confusing sometimes, but boy, when we know it, when we feel it, we know it, right? That really dark piece. So this can really erode the strongest recovery program. It's terribly costly, and it gradually really undermines. I think there's no more destructive or corrosive force against recovery than this resentment that can just go on and on. And it's really a slippery slope to relapse. So I want to point, so kind of pivoting a little bit to, okay, so what do we know about these? What can we do about them? And I really want to, and I don't do this often, but I want to go back to the big book, because I think there's a lot of really strong and good guidance about resentments and what to do with them. And it appears quite often at different stages. But the one I want to highlight tonight, the two actually, chapter 5 of the big book, where they lay this out. I'm just going to read a few lines. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. For we have not been only mentally and physically ill, we've also been spiritually ill. When our spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And that just, I think, identifies resentment as the central feature in part of our addictive process. And so the healing, where does that start? I think it starts in the fourth step, the personal inventory that we do. And this is also from the big book regarding the fourth step. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. We listed people, institutions, principles with whom we were angry. We ask ourselves why we were angry. In most cases, it was found out that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened. So we were sore, we were burned up. And that is so true. It's those things that start to affect us personally, or that we perceive as affected us personally, is where those are our buttons, those are our sensitive issues. And that's where resentment really can take root. So, and also I might add, I won't continue to read, but there's a lot of stuff about resentments in steps 10 and 11 in terms of how to release them and heal them. And we at Seeking Integrity practice the 10-step group at the end of every day. I think it's a great practice in our own lives as well, to really do that little kind of mini inventory on how we did the day and what we could have done better and what we've done. So let's talk about some specific things for releasing these. One, I think, is really to really identify the feeling under the resentment. And I always tell my clients that resentment or anger or any flavor of that feeling is a secondary emotion. That's a reactive emotion. That's not the bottom of what's really going on. That's a layer over the top. It's like clouds in the sky. But if we have to get down under those clouds, we have to drop down under that resentment and see what's really going on. What's the real sore assault feeling that I'm trying to maybe avoid. So what those are, they're usually much more kind of basic feelings. I'm scared. I'm hurt. I'm lonely. This is much more about me, these statements. And that's really, as a defense against really feeling those. I don't want to feel sad and lonely. It's so much so much easier to feel resentment about somebody as opposed to feeling that pain of those really strong emotions underneath. So in many ways, resentment and anger is a distraction. It's a defense against those feelings, but it's a distraction. But it's a very destructive one. And I think we can really cause a lot of problems. So always try to drop underneath the anger and see, what is it? What's going on there? Remembering that, by the way, and I didn't say this up front, resentment, and by the way I define resentment, is kind of an anger. And by the way, anger is a good emotion. We need to feel that. It's a healthy emotion, just like fear. All these emotions are meant to be information for us, to guide us, to protect us. But the problem is when we get stuck in those emotions, and we don't release them, and when we don't process them, we don't talk about them, it starts to get kind of stuck and ruminate and swirl around in this closed universe. And that's when it becomes a resentment. It's this kind of closed loop of stuff that we just can't seem to get past. So, which brings me to my next point, which is releasing them. It's really critical that we create some kind of escape where this stuff can be discharged and released in a healthy way. And I think a lot of addicts, myself included, have a history of, releasing resentment in not such a healthy way, right? There's right ways and wrong ways. But I think to really handle that, and really that involves a couple steps. It involves looking at our own role. I have to look at my role in this situation, whatever that is. And again, that's not something an addict really wants to do, or even probably knows how to do in the beginning. I think we have to it takes some practice and some courage, I think, to really understand that we play a role in a lot of these situations. We're not just, innocent bystanders that got affected by this. So looking at our own responsibility and looking at our own responsibility with some compassion, some self-compassion, to really understand, to be gentle with ourselves. I really try to take the approach when I'm doing a deep dive in myself to kind of understand what is going on. I try to adopt an attitude of curiosity, not which implies no judgment. I'm just kind of saying, okay, what's going on here? Well, what's this all about? Why am I feeling this? Without saying, God, what an idiot. You worked on that in therapy 2 years ago, or you shouldn't be feeling this anymore. Or, should, always, never, all those kind of dangerous words. But I really do a deep dive and kind of have some self-compassion and be more comfortable releasing. And then the release. And how do we do that in a healthy way? I think it's sitting down, it's being honest, it's sharing, and it can be talking to somebody else. It can be writing a letter. It can be physical activity to kind of do a physical release. I'm big on rituals, so I like the writing and burning kinds of things, or I live near the ocean, so we have clients kind of make maybe a little medicine bundle or something that represents whatever they're trying to let go of and take it down to the beach and throw it in the water. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to do it, but we have to kind of, I think, physically, whether that's actual a letter or an object, or just kind of energetically release this stuff for ourselves, get it out there because it's toxic and it'll bring us down. And so then along with that, I think comes some part of that release. There has to be a little healing piece that goes with that. And I think when we release the anger simultaneously, at least when I have that opportunity to release resentment or anger, I try to incorporate some empathy into that. Okay, this person or object or being or God or whoever I'm so angry at, say it's another person, to really try to develop some empathy toward that person. Maybe that person was also wounded. Maybe that person was also scared or sad or lonely or inadvertently did something that caused this reaction in me. But I think just really try to understand it, and anything that I can do to help me understand that I need this connection. I need connection in the world. And resentment just one by one cuts those off and isolates us. And so I think that empathy is a really nice kind of alternate energetic healing force to reconnect in a way that resentment cuts off those connections. Empathy helps us reestablish them. And finally, and I seem to put this into every solution, but I think to cultivate gratitude. You know, for me, resentment is one of those emotions that just leaves me feeling kind of really at the end of it. It's exhausting. It doesn't make me feel good. It doesn't make me feel, even if I kind of win whatever the situation is, I don't feel very good about it. And so I think gratitude for me is like the universal balm, the universal technique that I can use to kind of detoxify. And resentment and dealing with resentment leaves me kind of feeling yuck, like a hangover, an emotional hangover. And I think gratitude is one of the ways I can kind of correct that and get myself back on track. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Type your questions into the Q&A feature. We'll get to them as soon as we can here. And ask about resentments, ask about anything to do with addiction and recovery. There's a couple things I wanted to talk about here, I guess a little bit. Resentments can last a really, really, really long time. Am I right?
Absolutely. They can go on forever.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of years ago, David's heard this story before, but I called it my year of resentments. I think it was either 2017 or 2018, where I realized I had some resentments that I'd been carrying around since childhood, since my teens mostly. And you know, these people were getting space in my head that they did not deserve. I hadn't seen most of them in 35 or 40 years, you know. And I was having, I call it the 2,000-mile argument. I live in California, they live in Indiana. I'm arguing with them in, you know, driving down the street, having a full-blown knockdown, drag-out argument with somebody who I haven't seen in 35 years, who lives 2,000 miles away, and who doesn't know they're arguing with me. I mean, they have no idea, and it's very important for me to win the argument. And I was like, this is crazy. Why am I devoting time to these old resentments? And it wasn't killing me, but it was affecting my sobriety, and it was affecting my quality of life. So I had to really dig deep and do some of the work. And I you know, you mentioned step 4. Step 4 helped me with the big resentments. You know, the resentments against my mother and my father and, you know, the church, and, you know, I mean, the really big resentments I had. Step 4 was great because it made me look at my part, and it made me examine what I was feeling and what area of my life was threatened. It helped me understand the resentment, and then it was kind of easy to release it. I found the little resentments harder to release. Is that your experience, David? Do other people struggle with the little resentments?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I think that's true, because the big ones are kind of so glaring and lifelong, and just, I think we, they have a life of their own kind of. The fourth step, they're the obvious thing to be addressed early on, right? Because those are the big kind of the big monolithic things in our lives. But the little stuff, and I've often heard, I've heard it related to alcoholics, but I think it's true for any addict, is that we're really good with the big stuff, right? If they give us a crisis, I mean, we can jump in, we know what to do, we get all the big stuff done, we take action, we take charge, but it's the little small stuff that can really kind of blindside us, I think, is what you're talking about. And the little slights, the little kind of cross-eyed look of somebody that we interpret in a certain way, or even strangers not, you know, stepping your toe or that kind of stuff. It's kind of silly, but I think that depending on our headspace, absolutely can really hijack our day. And it has, as you know, it has much to do with me than them. But still, it's they become kind of little symbolic triggers that set these little explosions off. And I think if we're in that kind of victim-y mindset, that's much more likely to happen, because we're kind of looking for injuries. We accumulate injuries against us. And
yeah, and you know, I was finding myself taking these little injuries out and like playing with them, like watering them and feeding them a little bit,
oh yeah,
letting them grow bigger than they were, and they were kind of getting out of control, like they were big things instead of little things, you know.
And I didn't say something before, and that brought up another really important point. Anger and resentments are mood changers. They are a way of releasing dopamine and adrenaline, and I mean, it's as good as any kind of drug to really get us distracted and hijack us and get us, you know, energized. And there's a little bit of dopamine flowing around, and they're very seductive in that sense. And I think I look at really prolonged resentment and anger as a real mood changer and a real kind of relapse risk, because it gets us into that mindset of it's like a stepping out of ourselves, and it has a hangover too. I mean, people that have been really angry afterwards, you feel kind of just there. And I think that's so. I think one of the appeals of that, of taking it and playing with it, is kind of playing with an addictive behavior. You know, we kind of take it and roll around and get a little bit of a dopamine rush from it.
Yeah, I was using it, and then that's why I really decided to do something about it. I was using these old nothing resentments and letting them grow and become real resentments as a way of escaping from, you know, my day-to-day life or uncomfortable feelings, the same way that I used to use sex or drugs or alcohol.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I just wanted to add the technique that I used that was given to me early in recovery to use on some of the big resentments worked on the little ones, which was to pray for that person in the morning and in the evening every day for 30 days. Pray for them to have all the wonderful things in life that I would want for myself. And I will admit that every time I pray away resentment, I get resentful about having to pray for someone that I have resentment against. And that's part of my process.
Right.
Somewhere in the second week, my resentment about having to do this goes away, and then the actual resentment sometime between then and the end of the month goes away, and they pretty much stay away. And it's a nice feeling when they're gone. And once in a while, I'll catch myself reaching into that little, you know, resentment box, and the resentment just doesn't have any power anymore after doing this work. Wow. So this really, really does work. Whether it's a ritual or anything to release it and to kind of heal and feel some empathy. I think that's part of what that prayer does, is it totally lets us see the other person as a human being who is also struggling in life just like we are.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, I can talk about resentments forever, but let's get to the questions. So, okay, my husband and I see different CSATs. He was at Seeking Integrity Los Angeles early this year. There's no disclosure date yet. On webinars, experts suggest putting aside time for questions. Yet my husband refuses to answer any questions or put aside even 5 minutes a day, always only says he is working with his therapist. How do you interpret his refusal to answer any questions?
Well, I mean, just on the surface, it seems there's some resistance there. People have different ways of preparing it. Some people do a few questions each day. Some people prepare other things, the different styles. So that can vary from person to person. But I think what we're looking for is kind of forward momentum toward getting it done. The disclosure is a really important step in the healing of any relationship affected by sex addiction. And I think that timing is an important feature of that. We don't do it too soon, meaning in the first month or 2 months probably. But after that, I think it starts to become reasonable to start to look for it. And I think if it goes too far out onto the horizon, then there's a lot of momentum loss. And I think there may be some resistance or I was going to say kind of game playing, but I'm not sure that's the term I want to use. But I think it's indicative of something else going on there. So you're both saying CSATs. So I guess it's not unreasonable if you ask what his CSAT might be doing to help him on this, or what's happening with that, and see where it's at, because it does affect you. I think it's also not unreasonable to set a time. Okay, we need a disclosure by whatever that is for you. But I think it's reasonable to expect that as disclosure is being prepared and on the way. Many partners really rely on that disclosure to make decisions about the relationship, to make decisions about the level of trust they're willing to give or to give in the future, and to kind of set the scene for what they do. And so in many ways, delaying a disclosure really delays some resolution of a lot of issues for people. And so I think it's something we don't want to delay. Now, you don't want to rush it either, but I think early this year, I think it's reasonable to expect that there's some momentum toward it. And as I say, how people prepare it, there's different ways of doing that. Some people do a little bit each day. Some people do an intensive kind of preparation. But I think in my experience, this is not kind of like the paper you knock out the night before it's due in school. This is something that does require a lot of thought, and to put it down on paper, to set it away, take some time, step away from it, come back to it, add to it, revise it. It's a kind of a living document. So that in that sense, it does require some ongoing preparation. So I think there's some concern there.
Yeah, I popped a couple of resources into the chat feature. One of them is Steph Karn's book, Courageous Love, which is all about the process of disclosure. And then the other one is it's off our YouTube channel. It's a Q&A that Matt Wheeler and I did on disclosure, where I asked questions and Matt answered questions about disclosure. And we're going to have part 2 of that in August, by the way. I think August 13th, we're going to do that. So pop that on your calendar. Usually disclosure takes place 3 to 6 months, ideally, usually, and every case is different, 3 to 6 months after initial discovery. But there are reasons that could extend. There are reasons that it can be sped up, although there are many more reasons to extend and speed up. The one thing you don't want to do is for me to say, David, did you cheat with my niece? And have him answer that on the spot. That's a written question I give to him to answer in the formal therapeutic disclosure. It's not something we discuss tonight. That's what we call death by paper cut, where you find out a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit next, and you're just going to bleed to death very slowly. So I don't know if you're trying to get that out of your husband right now. If that's what you're trying to get with your husband right now, I'm with him. The one question he should answer is, when will I get full disclosure? That he should be answering. So push for that. And once you know that's going to happen, then you can formulate your list of questions. You give it to your therapist, who gives it to his therapist, who gives it to him, and he starts writing out his disclosure.
Thanks.
Okay, next one. I'm Canadian, and we have our sad stories about what the government and church have done to our First Nations for 150 years in the Indian schools. We now know that lots of trauma, neglect, and dead kids in the process have been inflicted for the last month. I resent both organizations because I was sexually abused by brothers to the point, not too coupled. Anyway, how can I reduce my anger and pain?
Right. Yeah, so I'm sorry about what happened. These are, yeah, this is long, deeply, right, embedded pain and anger, of course, over what happened. And any kind of abuse or trauma does result in this, justified anger. Um, Anger, as I said before, is a healthy emotion that lets us know something's going on. I think, again, I think it's important to drop under the anger and see what's there, whether it's fear or hurt or can be multiple things. When you have held on to it, right, that becomes the resentment. That's the issue we're talking about tonight. I think trauma work, if you haven't done it, would be important as a way to kind of release this, because trauma work therapy goes underneath the reactive feelings to the source of those feelings and resolves some of that pain and it doesn't take it away, of course, but it helps you deal with some of the reactive feelings and the leftover feelings that have been carried since that event. And so I think there's a lot of anger and resentment that would be released for you. And I think a lot of trauma therapy actually incorporates a lot of that release work, because what we do when we're traumatized by any event is it kind of freezes the process in our brain that helps us process these memories and emotions and kind of file them away in different compartments in our brain. That whole process gets stuck and frozen. And with that are these kind of unprocessed feelings that kind of circulate and ruminate. So I think the more work you can do on addressing the therapy, the trauma through therapy, I think the more you're going to find those emotions are released. What I would not do is just sit with those. And we described at the beginning of the webinar tonight about how it's easy to kind of ruminate about stuff and get stuck in it and go over and over it. Especially you mentioned in your question some big events, right, with big institutions and organizations and historical elements. And I think one thing we can do, and I'm not sure it's really productive in this sense, is that we can take something that happened to us and then sort of connect that to something that's happened to other people and something that's happened to all of us for a generation. And, it kind of builds, and that we're identifying in that sense with other people, but we're also that I don't see an outlet there to resolve it, or there's no resolution. It's just kind of building. It's almost a big rumination of it. So I'd really look for the work that can help you release it, the skills that can help you release it. And I think until you do some of the deeper trauma therapy work, it's going to keep generating anger that you're going to keep having to release. And so that's, I think, is really the key to everything, is kind of going down into those issues and helping yourself work through it. And by the way, don't ignore the piece I mentioned earlier about having compassion for yourself, because I think that is a key to this whole thing, is that things were done to you, things happened to you. And I think you really have to, as best you can, have compassion for yourself as somebody who survived, who's done the best you can, who's really got through this, and have compassion for that person back there. And I think that also helps kind of move this along.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, and David touched on this, you're dealing with multiple kinds of trauma. Christine Courtois, in her book, It's Not You, It's What Happened to You. Short book, very easy read, highly recommended. She identifies the types of trauma, one of which is what she calls intergenerational or inherited trauma. And this is the stuff that happened 150 years ago, where kids were abused, neglected, killed. And then there's another type of trauma, is this direct interpersonal abuse, which you also have suffered. And you're going to have to heal from both of those. And one of the points she makes in the book is they all hurt the same depending on the person. I mean, trauma is kind of subjective. A race car driver who has a fender bender going 5 miles an hour doesn't think anything about it. A new mother with her baby in the car who has a fender bender going 5 miles an hour, is freaked out. So everybody experiences trauma differently. So don't let anybody tell you that the stuff that didn't happen to you shouldn't be bothering you. It's an inherited or an intergenerational trauma that you have taken on, and it is sitting with you. So you are going to have to resolve that along with the more direct stuff. But I did want to hit on that, and my technique of prayer, I don't think is going to work on this one. I think you're going to have to do a lot of trauma work and then do some rituals to release things, and then go to gratitude and things like that. It's going to be a process.
But please be gentle with yourself through all this, because that's the key. Somehow when we're having that much resentment and anger, we can turn it back on ourselves so easily, and that's just counterproductive in every possible sense.
Yeah. Are there any common threads of resentments that you see in sex addiction for both the addict and the partner? So common resentments for sex addicts and betrayed partners.
It's an interesting question. I think I guess what I see a lot of sex addicts telling themselves is that they have certain entitlements that aren't being met in some way, and that kind of sets up this resentment where they feel entitled to then kind of take matters into their own hands and meet their own needs and do all that. So I think it goes back to the kind of the frame of reference that people have and how they view themselves, and are they being do they perceive themselves as being victimized or not? So I think I've dealt with a lot of kinds of addictions. I think I see that entitlement issue, I think, is more prominent with sex addiction per se. The other, on the partner side, I think
a lot of partners get resentful because they get blamed in one way or another. For the
Right.
addict blames them for the behavior, and I see a lot of betrayed partners carrying some resentment around, and rightfully so, carrying some resentment around about that.
Right, for sure. I don't know, Scott, other other patterns you see or can identify or think about?
Those are the big ones. But David, just because a resentment is righteous, is that less damaging, more damaging, equally damaging?
I think it could almost be more damaging, because again, that when we feel righteous about it, that kind of gives us that sort of, there's a sort of entitlement in that as well, right? We're entitled to do whatever we want, or to take whatever steps we think we have to take because we deserve to. And I think that can ultimately be self-destructive for sure. And righteous, to me, the righteous add-on there is really kind of fuel on the fire. It's an accelerant to the destructive properties of resentment in general. I think it just makes it all worse because we kind of lose perspective, and we believe in our core, and that's that kind of mood-changing resentment I was speaking of earlier. It's really strong and seductive. That's a momentary. That's like a sugar high. It feels good in the moment because wow, like we are empowered to be resentful, but it doesn't end well.
Okay, this next one here. For the first time in many months, I recently felt the need to check my husband's phone, where I found that while he was not acting out on his inner circle behaviors, he crossed some boundaries I had clearly expressed and included in my impact letter, playing on online games with unsafe women, downloading certain apps, etc. The questioner does say, it's clear my husband is still more sober than in recovery. This is kind of what we talked about, was either last week or the week before, the difference between sobriety and recovery, where you're not acting out, but maybe you're not making all the changes you need to make. I realize detective behaviors are also not healthy on my side. In the resulting chain of events, I wrote him a letter and asked him to put together a recovery plan and to begin sharing a little with me daily. I have sought my own support through my counselor support group and journaling. I know the sleuthing on my side is not healthy, so I'm wondering if there's some other ways to handle these gut checks in the future.
Yeah.
So rather than Sherlocking around, if she has some doubts, I mean, I just want to point out, I recently felt the need to check my husband's phone. That probably came from somewhere. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, right. So, I understand the behavior totally, right? Because your partners are looking for reassurance, they're looking for emotional safety, and just to know that everything's okay. And the problem with that strategy, by the way, is that there's never enough information to really make you totally feel reassured, because there's always that element of doubt that can creep in. So you're right, and I'm glad you recognize that, because it's not going to leave you feeling much better. However, to build on what Scott just said, some part of your gut told you maybe this might be an interesting thing, and I think that intuition, I think, is valid. I think when you feel that, it's important to take some kind of action. Sleuthing is probably not the best action to take, but what I would do, and I always encourage the couples I work with to have a daily check-in, and 10, 15 minutes of just really direct, honest communication, just what's going on, where are we at, that I think would be the context to bring up your concern. I have this feeling, I'm just would like reassurance that how you're in line with the circle plan that was agreed to, and where you're at with that, and the addict can lie, which is also not recovery behavior, obviously, but I think that kind of putting it out on the table. Now, might you get the answer you want or don't want? Yeah, I mean, anything could happen, or you might not get any answer. But I think you put it out there, and frankly, a non-answer is an answer, right? It's a response, and I think so. I think just to really try to use communication, direct communication, and and it'd be useful, I think, to identify maybe what felt the urge after so many months to check the phone, and really identify what that spark was, because it's important. There's a nice STEM sentence we use here sometimes. It's a great way of expressing behaviors. When you do X, it makes me feel Y. So it's you're sharing how you're feeling based on something your partner has done, and that's really, you can't argue with that, right? Because you're expressing a feeling which you have a legitimate right to have. You're observing behavior, and it's something that the partner needs to respond to at that point. And it's not really an attack. It's not really a criticism. It's just, hey, you're doing this, and it's making me feel this way. So I think maybe if you can define it in those kind of terms, it might be useful to frame the conversation. But I think probably a conversation is the best way to do that. Or if you're in that pre-disclosure process, Scott just mentioned this it's a little cumbersome, but it's very effective of passing communications on therapist to therapist and including that in your disclosure revelation.
Yeah, and David mentioned having a conversation is the way to go, rather than what we call Sherlocking, which is sneaking around to get information. As part of the conversation, you should be able to say, I'm feeling a little unsafe right now. I would like to check your phone. May I do that? That's a perfectly reasonable request. And if the addict, by the way, if you're the addict, the proper answer is yes. And if the answer is no, what are you hiding? You'll get your answer by whether you get to check the phone or not. You'll know. So it's okay, and you'll feel better about yourself for asking, rather than simply sneaking around and stealing his phone when he's asleep or in the shower or whatever. I'm assuming male, female here, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. So. I like that a lot, Scott. It's just upfront.
Yeah.
Upfront.
Yeah, you'll feel better about being upfront. And clearly you don't feel good about sneaking around and sleuthing, and nobody ever does. So just ask. And it's okay to ask. And again, if you're the addict, the answer is yes. That's the only answer. If you say no, your partner knows you're hiding something. So, okay, is helping people also a mood changer? Is it a stronger dopamine rush than anger? Great question.
It's a great question. And yes, I think helping people is a mood changer. It gives us, helping people is part of the inherent kind of instinctive dopamine circuitry that we're wired to get, right? When we collaborate and cooperate and work together and pair bond with somebody and do all those things that help us survive as a community and as a species. Yeah, that's exactly what this whole reward circuitry that's been hijacked by addiction, that was the core function of what it's supposed to do. And so, yeah, we do get a nice burst of dopamine when we do something nice for people. I don't know that it's stronger than anger, because anger has this mix of adrenaline and other kinds of cortisol and other kinds of hormones that kick it up into like a fight or flight reaction that is very a different flavor than helping people. But absolutely. And if there's we were talking with our clients today about kind of alternate sources of dopamine in recovery, and cooperating and collaborating and helping people is definitely on the list. Does it have the same kick and impact that porn does, or sexual addiction does, or even anger? No, it doesn't. It's a more mellow kind of dopamine, but it's very much a mood changer in a good way. I think so. Yeah, I think helping people is huge, and we feel good about it. And it's a much healthier way to be a little dopamine flowing.
Is this meeting only for wives of addicts? No, it is not. It's for addicts and betrayed partners, and we even get therapists to join us sometime. Everybody's welcome. Sometimes the questions will skew one way or the other. So please don't get a resentment about that. Is there such a thing as a healthy resentment?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I said before, anger, I think is healthy. Remember, if we take a step back here, every emotion, and anger is a basic emotion, although it's usually secondary, as I mentioned, to some other core feeling, but it's part of our constellation of normal feelings or emotions. Those are all good. They're our dashboard. They're the little indicator lights and dials and stuff that we know what's going on with ourselves, and we can take action. They're information. They're sources of information. That's what they were designed to be. When we don't identify them, feel them, and release them as they're meant to be, that's how they're designed to be. But if they somehow get frozen, or if we grab onto them and don't let them go, or if they get kind of caught up in our system, and spend too long, it's like something in the refrigerator, it's gone bad, right? It's sticking around long past its due date. And I think so I think just by definition, no, I don't think there's a healthy resentment. I think resentment, by the time something has become a resentment, it's a problem. Now, anger, I think anger can be healthy, but it has to be identified and expressed and released. Expressed in a healthy way too, by the way, and then released. That's okay. But I think once something gets trapped and we start to ruminate about it, and it gets stuck in this closed system and becomes resentment, that I don't know of any positive benefit of that, in short.
How do I approach my partner when I feel resentment toward her? What is a healthy way to deal with this?
Okay, I think when we're feeling resentment towards somebody, the first thing we do is let's stop and breathe. Okay, I think so many addicts jump into dealing with it, or not really dealing with it, but to addressing it, to expressing their resentment, more than even working toward a solution.
A resentment, by the way, it's not anger in the moment; it's a lingering anger. So,
right,
what we're talking about here, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I think to breathe and to really get in touch with what's going on within me. Because remember, as I mentioned in the beginning, that a resentment is all about that kind of victim place. And so I've been wronged somehow. And I think to really go back and, okay, let's just take a moment, take a pause. What role did I play in this? What feeling what's really going on here? Am I scared? Am I lonely? Am I hurt? My feelings hurt? Just to really identify what's really going on. And I think once you have that core feeling that's under the anger identified, that's the basis to start a conversation, right? Then you can say, gee, when you did X, Y, Z, I felt, angry, and I've held on to it, and it's turned into resentment. But what I really see is that I'm lonely, or I'm scared, or whatever. But I think you can have a really productive dialogue if you're talking about those kind of other emotions that are underneath the resentment. But if you start with the resentment to try to talk it out, I don't think it's going to go anywhere pretty. I think it's going to get ugly pretty fast. So, and it's just not productive. But I think if you can really center yourself, see what's really going on with you, to go dive deep inside there and see what's going on. And if you have the ability to own what's going on with you and own your part of any situation, that's the point at which I think it's healthy and useful to engage in dialogue with the other person.
And that kind of dialogue can turn a resentment into intimacy.
Absolutely.
Actual intimate connection, which is what we're all sort of searching for here. But there is a way to do it, and the way is, when this happened, I felt this way, and I continue to feel this way, and it's lingering, and I want to get rid of this. Can we talk about it, or something like that? It's about me and what I'm feeling. It's not necessarily about what I'm mad at you about, although we are going to have to talk about that. So
yeah, and I think in those conversations, Scott's right. We do have to talk about it, but I think if you're an observer monitoring pronouns in the conversations, there should be a whole lot more I than you, right? This is more about what I'm feeling, it could be when you did X, Y, Z, then I had this reaction. I'm lonely, or I'm scared, I'm concerned, and express it that way. But I think otherwise it can go off the rails a little bit.
Yeah, and this is another trick that a lot of people use that I was taught really early in recovery was take your higher power into the room with you. So I will often invite my higher power, pretty much beg my higher power to please come in with me because I'm going to need some help. And for some reason that helps a little bit. I don't know. I don't have all the answers about higher powers, but sometimes I think just the action of saying, I want my best self, which involves my higher power, to walk into the room and walk into this conversation. I think that helps sometimes.
And I would just add on that, and those that know me well know that I can be a little woo-woo. I'm a Reiki, credential Reiki person, but I think it's useful. And if you're uncomfortable with like a higher power concept, I work with clients to identify resources, and the resource may be the memory of a grandmother who may have been the only kind person in your childhood, or a teacher that was always kind of there for you, or just something like that. Just the memory of those people can really be a resource to calm us down internally when we're going into a stressful situation like that. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I love this next question because it ties into resentments without being a specific resentments question. Is there a way to take back special dates that you may have destroyed by acting out on those days, i.e. birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, things like that? How can you take those days back?
Yeah, it's hard to reverse those. I think what I recommend to a lot of couples is to start creating new memories, new celebrations, new events. You want to kind of but create new history, new memories that overwrite some of the bad times. I mean, healing is all about new connections and new memories. And I think so you might either on that same day, maybe create some other new kind of holiday or recognition of that day that doesn't kind of just totally forget the pain or injury, but I think it kind of neutralizes it or at least gives something else to celebrate. And I think that's the way to do it. I guess I'd call that reframing it. Just kind of reframe that holiday. So it's not a constant reminder of pain or just to maybe convert it somehow, flip it on its head and make what was a painful day into some kind of, in recovery, more of a triumphant day or a celebration day or some recognition of the pain. But I think unless it's some major event, a unique single major event, like if you have an ongoing thing like a birthday or, from Christmas, and my family of origin was always, I knew something not so wonderful was going to happen, just family conflict and stuff. So Christmas is always still tense for me. But I think if we can kind of make new Christmas traditions, for example, in that example, it can be helpful to kind of start to overwrite that. What about you, Scott? What would you do with that? Whoops, you're muted.
I agree with you. I think it's all about creating new traditions and new rituals, and more importantly, doing it together.
Yes,
what can we do together to take this day back for us? Frame it that way, and you know, there's probably still going to be some moments that you'd rather not have on your birthday or her birthday or, you know, whatever, but, you know, just take it back. Yeah. When I see a trigger, someone whom I'm attracted to, I get incredibly sad or resentful. I'm a gay man and mostly attracted to straight masculine men. I live in an area with a lot of conservative family types. I see what they have and I tell myself that because I'm an addict with a ton of terrible defects and a sordid past, I don't get what everyone else does. I know that's just self-pity. What should I do to not feel so terrible?
Hi, great question. And I think you kind of identified the theme running through here was that kind of that victim thing with the self-pity and feeling bad and feeling, you know, there's another thing here. I haven't used this word tonight, but it's a important kind of adjunct to resentment. And that's this kind of feeling that we're somehow unique. And that can then lead to entitlement and lead us down a path of trouble. So I think it's going to be important to break out of that self-pity and that idea of victim and to see, because when we are in that kind of victim stance, we don't have responsibility for what's happening. We don't have power over what's happening. This is just happening to us because of this terrible situation. And I guess I would just encourage you to find your power in this. And also, by the way, find your responsibility. Maybe how are you contributing to the situation, if any? If only through your assumption that just because you're XYZ, you can't have this. And so I think I would just really work on some of those core beliefs that you carry about yourself and what this means. Identify with this. I have lived in a similar space for a while, and I was not a happy camper because it was always about what I couldn't have and everybody else did, and it just felt bad. And so I would just really kind of do some work on the inside of you to find, you know, what your role is in this, but also what your strengths are and what the reality is. Because I think I also, there's kind of some black and white thinking here. I think that there may be a lot more options and ways of looking at the situation than you can see right now. And I think therapy or work, or even work with a sponsor, or talking about this, just even starting to talk about this issue would start to open up some perspective. I think this is an issue of perspective. So just be cautious, because this is one of those examples, if I may use this one to generalize, where we can really sort of get ourselves in trouble just by assumptions and by how we view things, and that idea of resentment or self-pity or victimhood or all that kind of sets us apart. It's a very defeated, sad, and lonely place to be in. And I'm sorry you're there, because I know how that feels. But I think I would encourage you to take responsibility and see what you can do and what you can do about that. And if that may mean changing your viewpoint, how you frame things, changing your view of yourself. For me, it took, frankly, moving to somewhere else where I felt more comfortable and like I belonged. But I think any of that, there's many more options, I think, than you may be able to see right now. And I would encourage you just to kind of talk that through with somebody who can help you see how this situation may be related to other situations in your life and how you view yourself, that in terms of your internal beliefs about yourself. You know, I've worked with a lot of gay men over the years. I am a gay man myself, and the phrase I've heard so often for 30 years, different generations of gay men, I feel like damaged goods. You know, just nobody's going to want me, just totally flawed, rooted in shame. And that's just a terrible space to be in. And so my hope for you is that you can get out of that space and really find some solutions for yourself.
Yeah, one of the things that actually helped me was working step 4. And we've talked about it a little bit as kind of a parallel for getting rid of a resentment is, one of the things you look at in step 4 is resentment. But we also take a look at our strengths and we figure out that maybe we're not so terrible and maybe we've done some things we're not proud of, but we're not horrible people. Step 4, and I was very much a victim before I worked step 4. And then I kind of realized I'm not a victim. I'm the one in control of my life, and I can make decisions that will make my life better. And, David said, move. Yeah, I'm like, oh my God, move somewhere where, it's more to a more accepting community. But sometimes that's not so easy, but there are other things you can do. And I think steps 4 really through step 12, in addition to therapeutic work, is very, very helpful in changing our self-image and how we view ourselves, and more importantly, how we view ourselves in connection with the rest of the world. Because I thought I was a horrible person and a victim, and then I worked the steps, and in conjunction with therapy and all the other things David suggested, and I don't feel that way about myself anymore. So, yeah. We have time for one more quick one. I'm sorry, we're not going to get anywhere near through all the questions today. I have anger toward my ex since he assaulted me and is still in the city I live in, and I may see him again. How do I let go of the fear that I may see him again? And the police report I filed did not lead to an arrest, which I would think might lead to a resentment. But the real question here is, how do I let go of the fear about seeing him again, potentially seeing him again?
Right. This is a really tough situation. I'm sorry. I don't know that I have an easy answer for you either. I think to really just focus on empowering yourself to the greatest degree you can, right? Whether that's being in an emotionally healthy place, really, again, these are resentment by definition we've talked about is this thing that we hang on to and kind of lingers. And I think the same thing can happen. Honestly, what I would do with this, I would look at this as a trauma and approach it as a trauma that's happened to you, and get some support in terms of trauma therapy, because this is what happens with victims of assault and abuse, that it's traumatic. And I think the healing process of trauma therapy would go a long way toward addressing some of these feelings. I think that's the best approach I can suggest.
Yeah, domestic violence is sadly all too common in straight couples and gay couples and every kind of couple you can imagine. Domestic violence is way too common. Does a self-defense course help, or is that a different kind of trauma that a self-defense course helps people feel safe?
No, I think it can help. It can make you feel more confident and able to take care of yourself. What assault or any kind of trauma like this does is it steals, it robs us of our ability to feel safe. And so if you can do things that make you feel safe, and some of that's emotional, bolstering your emotional safety and your ability to deal with adverse kind of emotional stuff, but also I think it definitely moves into the physical realm as well, to know that you can at least go a long way toward protecting yourself. I think that's, but I think the self-defense without dealing with the inner stuff is not going to work, because if you still have that belief that that you're vulnerable inside in a bad way, vulnerability can be a good thing, but vulnerable in face of this person that you might encounter, you can have all this self-defense in the world. It's not going to help that internal space.
Yeah, I'm sorry you're going through that. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, David, for your time and thoughts and expertise. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions today, but join us next week. Bring your questions back. We'll be happy to answer them, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Scott. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everybody.